Okay, first of all, I want to thank the History Club for making me volunteer to give this talk. All right? And Jose has done a lot of work preparing this. So, the subject of this is Lincoln and God. And it concerns the part that religion played in Lincoln's life. Naturally, it doesn't pretend to provide definitive answers to the question, because there are a lot of controversies surrounding it. But as historians and students of history acknowledge, trying to break down what is in the life of a man's beliefs, his religious ideas, is a very difficult question. So there is some evidence that we can turn to that I'll refer to as we go on. Of course, as we learn more about a subject by relying upon the findings of other historians, and doing comparative studies, we can leave the next generation, hopefully, with some evidence that will help them understand a little bit more about the subject. There is considerable evidence pointing to Lincoln's doubts about revealed religion, especially in his early life. And by that I mean from, say, his teenage years up to about 1840. Chronologically, that would be the rough idea for this first part of Lincoln's understanding of religion. Recall that Lincoln grew up in Kentucky, Indiana, and finally set roots in Illinois. In that period, he was exposed to a variety of Christian ideas that can be labeled as fundamentalist, all right? Especially toward the scriptures. His parents were Baptists, and other fundamentalists could be found in other religions among them, such as the Methodists. In each case, these religions were often split into a variety of sects, each proposing different interpretations of the Bible. They devoted a great deal of attention to promoting their own particular theologies, often engaging in what Lincoln found at that time to be unnecessary and senseless arguments about the meaning of this passage or that book of the Scriptures. Lincoln found these disputations to be at odds with his growing awareness of the rationalism found in the writings of the Founding Fathers, especially the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, who, as we know, wrote his own version of the New Testament, praising the parables and moral teachings of Jesus, while describing the supernatural and miracles which he deemed unacceptable based on the natural law. Lincoln was impressed by the arguments of skeptics who would join in argumentation, maybe at the local Cracker Barrel store, rejecting the absolutism of fundamentalist faiths. He heard about Voltaire and the attacks of Thomas Paine, who assailed religion as intolerant and based on erroneous precepts promoted by the priestly caste. To him, one document stood out above all, and that was our Declaration of Independence. He rejected the attack on the Founding Fathers as being hypocritical, just because they had slaves. He argued and agreed with Charles Black, who would write that the Declaration was the lodestar of our ancient faith and of all our moral principles. This meant a lot to him. It meant that all men are created equal, even though the inequality existed in the South and would persist for a number of decades. Even today, there are conflicts among historians, with some extremely critical of the document proposing individual freedom while assailing the individual freedom of one race at the expense of another. Some historians defend the Fathers as having given the most powerful doctrine there is for eventual emancipation. This, Lincoln agreed, was the true voice of freedom, that all men are created equal. His unrelenting devotion to Jefferson led him to be influenced by deism, rationalism, and more so in those early days, become known as joining the ranks of those who opposed organized religion. He listened to attacks on the virgin birth, miracles, and even the divinity of Christ. Clearly, this phase in Lincoln's religious journey set him against established beliefs of those who followed a traditional view of the Bible and religion. And yet this was going to change as time goes on. For example, at that time, when Sunday services ended, he was observed surrounded by friends who listened as he mimicked the sermons of some of the pastors whom he found wanting in wisdom and honesty. Preachers that he saw as bent on arousing only the emotional response of their congregants. He was drawn to ministers, however, like Pastor Jesse Head, who conducted the wedding of his father to Nancy Hanks, because he heard from him an unrelenting and uncompromising attack on slavery. To Lincoln, the essential character of religion, therefore, was its dedication to the moral law and its commitment to the ideal that all men were born equal in God's eyes. It is never clear at this time whether Lincoln adheres to a personal God or to the God of the deists, the God of nature. Theologically, it would seem that Lincoln had a unique perception of how a higher power worked in the shaping of those events and leading men to their predetermined ends. His idea of predestination is explained by David Donald as thinking that events were foreordained by immutable natural laws. In time, Lincoln seems to substitute the word God and abandon the notion of mere natural compulsions. He tried to explain his concept of fatalism with an example. You know, he said in typical Midwestern drawl, the pilots of our western rivers steer from point to point in plotting their course, no farther than they could see. And this is all I propose in addressing this great question. In other words, I'm going to let the drift of the waters of time and events govern my decisions. Don't rush me to show the way until I am ready. When later challenged by his opponents for his flirtations with deism and rationalism, he defended himself, saying, "That I am not a member of any Christian church is true, but I have never spoken intentionally in disrespect of religion in general or of any denomination." He went on to admit, "It is true that in my early life I was inclined to believe in the doctrine of necessity, that is, that the human mind is impelled to action or held at rest by some power over which the mind has no control. And so often during the Civil War, one hears Lincoln repeating and referring to the power of heaven, to a God who is supporting the struggle for liberty, or to a God who is sitting in judgment on us because of our guilt in fostering slavery. He was fond of quoting Shakespeare. He knew the tragedies almost by heart and read them over and over. And he quotes, "There's a divinity that shapes our will, rough-hewn though it may be." His fatalism led him to declare to his colleagues, "You wish to know my policy. Well, my policy is to have no policy." David Donald attributes many of Lincoln's virtues to this fatalism. Things happen sometimes because they must. His toleration, his compassion, led him to grant to others the benefit of the doubt. His fatalism cleared a path for his own virtue, knowing that somehow he would be beholden to a higher power. But indisputably, there is evidence of Lincoln's cynicism of religion in these early days. One of his good friends, James Matheny, said that Lincoln went further than any other person that he ever heard of at that time, questioning Christian doctrine. He even set forth some of these views on religion in a pamphlet filled with attacks on miracles and the scriptures that one of his friends, Samuel Hill, was astonished when he found out about it. Hill grabbed it and threw it into the fireplace before Lincoln could publish it, saying that if this ever gets to the public, your future in politics and law will be irrevocably damaged. A number of historians have pursued this issue and have come to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, there was such a pamphlet. But on a personal level, no one ever disputed either his intellect or his character. A non-smoker, drinker, and gambler at a time when many men were fond of these habits, Lincoln once shared a train with a gentleman who offered him a wad of chew. Lincoln said politely, "No, I don't chew." "Well," he said, "I have a fine cigar." Lincoln said, "I don't smoke." Finally, at length, the man said, "Here, take a sip of this. It's a cup of fine brandy." Lincoln said, "I'm sorry, but I don't drink, I don't chew, and I don't smoke." At length, the exasperated traveler said, "Well, you may be a fine fellow, but a man without some vices can't be a true gentleman." In evaluating a person's religion, one must also include the interactions a person has with the associates and their opinion of him. A gentleman by the name of McClure, a senator, came to see Lincoln. He had never met Lincoln in person before. This was in 1861. "I confess that my heart sank," said McClure, "as I remembered that this was the man chosen by a great nation to be its ruler. His slouchy pantaloons, his open black vest, sleeves tightly fitted, right? Displaying an awkwardness that was uncommon in men of his stature and intelligence. For nearly 4 hours,